To understand the shock that was coming, you have to understand the smell of a U-boat. It was a unique, wretched stench. A mixture of diesel fuel, battery acid, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and cologne water, a cheap perfume used to mask the odor. For the German U-boat crews, the Grey Wolves, life was a test of endurance. They lived in a steel tube for months at a time. There were no showers. Fresh water was strictly rationed for drinking only. They grew beards not for style, but because shaving was a waste of water. And then there was the food. At the start of a patrol, it was good. Fresh sausages, bread, fruit. But the dampness of the submarine destroyed everything. Within 2 weeks, the bread would turn into a green, moldy brick. The crew would have to scrape the fuzz off just to eat it. The sausages would turn slimy. The potatoes would rot in the lockers, filling the boat with a sickening sweet smell. By the end of a patrol, the crew was living on hardtack, biscuits as hard as stone, and tinned meat that tasted like metal. They were vitamin C deficient. Their gums bled. They lost weight. But they accepted this squalor. They were told it was necessary. They were told that Germany was a nation under siege, fighting against the world. They believed that their sacrifice was noble. They believed that the soft Americans and British couldn't handle this kind of hardship. The German propaganda machine reinforced this. It told them that the enemy was starving too. It told them that the U-boat blockade was working, that British sailors were eating rats, that American ships were empty. The German U-boat captain sat in his tiny wardroom, eating his moldy bread, and felt a grim satisfaction. He believed he was winning the war of attrition. He believed that his suffering was the currency of victory. He didn't know that just a few miles away, on the surface, an enemy ship was passing by that contained a reality he couldn't even imagine. He was living in a sewer, convinced he was besieging a castle. He was about to find out that the castle had a swimming pool and a buffet. The German worldview in World War II was built on the concept of scarcity. Germany lacked oil. It lacked rubber. It lacked rare metals. It lacked food. The entire Nazi ideology was based on Lebensraum, the need to conquer land to survive. Every German officer was trained to be frugal. Waste nothing. If a truck broke down, you stripped it for parts. If a soldier died, you reused his boots. This mindset extended to how they viewed the enemy. They projected their own scarcity onto the Allies. Admiral Donitz calculated tonnage sinking rates based on the idea that the Allies had a limited supply of ships. He assumed that if he sank enough ships, the Allies would run out. He assumed that the American economy, while large, was subject to the same laws of physics and economics as Germany. You cannot ship what you do not have. German intelligence reports emphasized the success of the U-boats. England is gasping. America is stretching its supply lines to the breaking point. The U-boat captains believed these reports. They saw the burning tankers through their periscopes. They saw the debris fields. They thought they were tightening the noose. When they captured Allied sailors, they often saw men who were wet, scared, and oil-covered. This confirmed their bias. The enemy looked defeated. But they rarely saw the inside of the ships they sank. They sent them to the bottom before they could inspect the cargo. This lack of direct contact preserved the illusion. The German officer class was insulated from the truth by the very water they patrolled. They were fighting a phantom enemy, a starving, desperate version of America that existed only in the mind of Joseph Goebbels. They didn't know that the real America was just over the horizon, and it was bringing a grocery store to the battlefield. The collision between the German myth of scarcity and the American reality of abundance was inevitable. And when it happened, it would shatter the morale of the Kriegsmarine more effectively than any depth charge. May 1945. The North Atlantic. The war in Europe was ending. Admiral Donnet sent the signal, "All U-boats, cease hostilities. Surface and surrender." For one particular U-boat commander, let's call him Captain Lieutenant Müller, a composite of several historical accounts, this was the end of the world. He had fought for years. He had lost his friends. He had endured the mold, the lice, and the fear. He surfaced his boat, U-1234, in the grey swell of the Atlantic. He hoisted the black flag of surrender. On the horizon, a massive shape appeared. It wasn't a destroyer. It was a U.S. Navy supply ship, a specialized vessel, perhaps a replenishment oiler or a cargo transport. It was huge. It towered over the tiny, rusted U-boat. The American ship signaled Müller to prepare to be boarded, or to come aboard. Müller ordered his crew to stand on deck. They looked like ghosts, pale, bearded, their leather uniforms stained with oil and salt. They looked up at the American ship. The first thing they noticed was the condition of the hull. It was clean. The paint was fresh gray. There was no rust. In Germany, paint was scarce. Ships went to sea looking battered. This American ship looked like it had just launched yesterday. The American sailors lining the rail looked down at the Germans. They were wearing clean blue dungarees. White hats. They didn't look starving. They looked bored. They were smoking cigarettes, casually flicking half-finished butts into the water. Müller watched a cigarette hit the water. In his boat, a cigarette was a treasure. Men traded watches for them. Here, they were trash. A launch was sent over. Müller and his senior officers were transferred to the American ship. He climbed the rope ladder, his heart heavy. He was a defeated warrior stepping onto the victor's territory. He expected to be treated harshly. He expected a brig. He expected to see an enemy that was just as tired and worn out as he was. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped onto the steel deck. And he stepped into a different world. The first shock was the smell. Müller expected the smell of war, diesel, cordite, unwashed bodies, burnt metal. Instead, the air on the deck of the USS Supply smelled sweet. It smelled of fresh bread. It smelled of roasting coffee. It smelled of laundry detergent. It was the smell of a well-run hotel, not a warship. The American officer of the deck saluted him. "Welcome aboard, Captain." The American's uniform was crisp. His shirt was pressed. Müller looked at his own greasy leather coat and felt a sudden, deep shame. He was led below decks. The passageways were bright. Fluorescent lights hummed. The floors were polished linoleum, not gritty steel plates. The air was cool. Air conditioning. In the U-boat, the temperature was usually 30 degrees Celsius, 86 F, with 100% humidity. Here, it was a pleasant 20 degrees, 68 F. They passed a water fountain. An American sailor stopped, pressed a button, and drank a stream of clear, cold water. Muller stared. On his boat, water was rationed by the cup. It tasted of the tank. Here, it flowed freely. The sailor didn't even finish the drink, he let the water run for a second before walking away. The casual waste of fresh water was stunning. Then, they entered the wardroom, the officers' mess. Muller stopped in his tracks. There was a table set with a white tablecloth. There were plates of food. Not just food. Fresh food. A bowl of oranges. Green apples. In Germany, an orange was a Christmas miracle. Here, they were a centerpiece. There was a pot of coffee. Real coffee. The aroma filled the room. The American captain gestured to a chair. "Have a seat, Captain. Would you like some eggs?" "Eggs. Fresh eggs." Muller sat down. He felt dizzy. He wasn't overwhelmed by the guns or the radar or the depth charges. He was overwhelmed by the breakfast. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the propaganda was a lie. The Americans weren't starving. They weren't struggling. They were fighting a war with one hand tied behind their backs, and holding a cup of coffee with the other. He looked at the orange on the table. It was bright, round, and perfect. It was the most intimidating weapon he had ever seen. After the shock of the fresh eggs, Captain Lieutenant Muller was led deeper into the ship. The American captain seemed to be enjoying this. He wasn't interrogating Muller about U-boat wolf packs or codes. He was giving him a tour. He knew that the most effective weapon he had wasn't his sidearm, it was his ship's inventory. They entered the galley. It was a stainless steel cathedral of food preparation. There were electric mixers. There were massive ovens baking fresh bread. The smell was intoxicating. But then, Muller saw the machine. It stood in the corner, gleaming chrome. An American sailor walked up to it, pulled a lever, and filled a bowl with a swirl of white, frozen cream. Ice cream. In Germany, in 1945, ice cream was a memory. It was something from a fairy tale, a treat for children in peacetime. Sugar was rationed. Milk was rationed. Ice was a luxury. Yet here, on a warship in the middle of the hostile Atlantic Ocean, a machine was dispensing it on demand. The American captain handed a bowl to Muller. "Vanilla," he said. "We have chocolate on Sundays." Muller took the bowl. The cold stung his fingers. He took a spoonful. It was sweet, creamy, and cold. It was a shock to his system. His body, used to the gray, flavorless diet of the submarine, didn't know how to process the sugar rush. He looked at the machine. It was complex. It required electricity, refrigeration, and specialized maintenance. He thought about the engineering effort required to put an ice cream maker on a ship. In the German Navy, every ounce of weight was calculated for lethality. If it didn't help kill the enemy, it wasn't on board. Torpedoes. Diesel. Shells. The Americans had dedicated weight, space, and power to desert. It was a slap in the face. It said, "We are so rich, we are so powerful, that we can afford to bring our luxuries with us to the battlefield." Muller realized that he wasn't just fighting a military force. He was fighting a civilization that refused to be inconvenienced by the war. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to win while eating ice cream. The arrogance of it was staggering. The capability of it was terrifying. The American captain, seeing Muller's astonishment, decided to twist the knife a little deeper. He told Muller about what was happening in the Pacific Theater. "You think this is something?" the American asked. Out in the Pacific, the Navy commissioned a special barge. The Quartz. Muller listened, struggling to understand the translation. The U.S. Navy had built a concrete barge, a BRL, barge, refrigerated, large. It had no engines. It had no guns. It had no radar. Its sole purpose was to make ice cream. It was a floating factory that cost $1 million. It carried enough supplies to manufacture 500 gallons of ice cream every single shift. It was towed around the Pacific, anchoring near island bases or fleet anchorages, solely to deliver treats to the troops. Muller stared at the American. He thought it was a joke. A lie? "A ship for ice cream?" he asked. The American nodded. "Logistics, Captain. Morale is a supply item, just like bullets." For Muller, this was insanity. Germany was melting down church bells to make bullets. They were scraping the bottom of the barrel for raw materials. They couldn't build enough U-boats to defend their coast. And the Americans were building concrete ships to make frozen desserts. The disparity in resources was so vast it was almost comical. If the Americans could afford to waste tonnage on an ice cream barge, what couldn't they build? It implied that their capacity for building tanks, bombers, and carriers was effectively infinite. They weren't choosing between guns or butter. They were choosing guns and butter and ice cream. The concept of the ice cream barge broke something in Muller's mind. It proved that the German strategy of attrition was a fantasy. You cannot deplete an enemy who has enough surplus capacity to industrialize the production of snacks in a war zone. Muller looked at his half-eaten bowl of vanilla. It didn't taste sweet anymore. It tasted like defeat. The tour continued. They went down into the cargo holds. The USS Supply, a composite name for the narrative, was carrying replenishment stores for the fleet. The hatch covers were pulled back. Muller looked down into the cavernous belly of the ship. It looked like a department store had been dumped into a hull. He saw crates of Coca-Cola. Thousands of them. The red labels bright under the cargo lights. He saw boxes of fresh fruit. Oranges from Florida. Grapefruits. He saw crates of new boots. Not the cardboard leather ersatz boots the German infantry were wearing, but high-quality rubber and leather. He saw baseball gloves. Magazines. Gramophone records. He saw razor blades. In Germany, a razor blade was used until it was a jagged piece of rusty metal. Here, there were cases of them. He saw piles of white cotton socks. It was an overwhelming display of consumer goods. German propaganda had painted the war as a struggle for survival. A total war where every sacrifice was necessary. This hold proved that for America, the war was an export industry. They were exporting the American lifestyle to the front lines. Muller saw a crate of Hershey's tropical chocolate, specially formulated not to melt in the heat. The Germans couldn't even get synthetic rubber for their tires, and the Americans were engineering heat-resistant chocolate. The level of detail was insulting. It showed a nation that had mastered the material world. Muller thought of his family back in Hamburg. They were likely standing in line for hours to get a loaf of bread and a few grams of margarine. Here, just a few feet away through a steel bulkhead, was enough food to feed his entire neighborhood for a year. The Ersatz Empire of Germany was fighting the brand name Empire of America. And the brand names were winning. Every crate in that hold was a bullet fired at the German morale. It screamed, "You cannot beat us. We have too much." They moved to the scullery, where the crew's meal was being cleaned up. This was the moment that truly horrified the German officer. Muller watched a young American mess cook clearing trays. The sailors had eaten steak and potatoes. Massive portions. Many of the trays were coming back half full. A half-eaten steak. A mound of mashed potatoes. A pile of green beans. In Germany, leaving food on a plate was a crime. It was a sin against the fatherland. Mothers taught their children to wipe the plate clean with bread because the soldiers need it. Muller watched the American cook. He didn't scrape the leftovers into a container to be reused. He didn't save the meat for a stew. He simply banged the tray against a trash can. Thump. The steak, the potatoes, the beans, the calories that would have been fought over in a German trench, fell into the slop chute. They were flashed out of the ship, into the Atlantic Ocean, to feed the fish. Muller physically flinched. The waste was casual. Routine. The American sailors didn't even notice it. They were joking, laughing, throwing away food that men were dying for a few hundred miles to the east. This was the ultimate flex of a superpower. To be so rich that you can afford to throw away the very things your enemy is dying to obtain. It showed a complete lack of desperation. The Germans were fighting a war of existence. The Americans were fighting a war of surplus. Muller looked at the garbage can. It contained more nutrition than his U-boat crew had consumed in the last week. He felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't the motion of the ship. It was the vertigo of realizing how small his world was compared to this one. The Nazi leadership had told him that the American economy was a house of cards, weak and corrupt. But standing in that scullery, watching a T-bone steak slide into the garbage, Muller knew the truth. The American economy was a juggernaut. A monster that could afford to be wasteful because it produced more than it could ever consume. The waste was the weapon. And against that kind of abundance, the iron will of the German soldier was meaningless. After the shock of the garbage cans, Muller was led to the bakery. In the German Navy, bread was baked on shore. It was loaded onto the U-boats in sacks. It was a hard, dark rye bread, Kommissbrot. It was nutritious but dense. After 2 weeks at sea, it was usually hard as a brick or covered in green mold. German sailors spent hours scraping the mold off their bread just to eat it. On the USS Supply, Muller saw a different reality. He saw a machine. Dough was being mixed in massive stainless steel vats by electric beaters. It was then portioned out onto a conveyor belt, moving through a long, low oven. At the other end, perfectly browned loaves of white bread were sliding out, steaming. The smell of yeast and warm flour filled the compartment. The American baker, a young man in a white t-shirt, picked up a loaf. He squeezed it. It was soft, sponge-like. To Muller, white bread was a delicacy for the rich. It required refined flour, which was scarce in wartime Germany. Here, it was being produced on an industrial scale, 24 hours a day, in the middle of the ocean. The baker sliced a piece and offered it to Muller with a slab of butter. Real butter. Not margarine. Not lard. Muller ate it. It was soft, sweet, and airy. It tasted like a cloud. It lacked the substance of German bread, but it possessed something more important: freshness. It represented a supply chain that could deliver delicate, perishable ingredients to a warship. It represented a technology that could automate the oldest human task, baking bread, even while hunting submarines. Muller realized that the American sailor was never truly at sea. He brought the land with him. He brought the bakery, the factory, and the farm. The German sailor left civilization behind when he closed the hatch. He entered a primitive world of survival. The American sailor brought civilization with him. This technological disparity broke Muller's heart. He realized that his crew back on the U-boat were living like cavemen compared to these soft Americans. But cavemen armed with clubs don't win against men armed with automated bakeries. The soft bread was a hard lesson. The tour ended in a space that Muller couldn't even comprehend. The ship's laundry. In the U-boat service, you wore your clothes until they rotted off your body. Leather uniforms were worn because they didn't absorb the filth as much as cloth. But after a 3-month patrol, a U-boat crew was coated in a layer of oil, sweat, and grime that was practically a second skin. The smell was indescribable. Here, on the American ship, Muller saw rows of industrial washing machines. He saw steam presses. He saw sailors folding crisp, clean white sheets. Clean sheets. On a warship. The American captain explained, almost casually, that the U.S. Navy had specialized ships, barge, laundry, BL, whose only job was to wash clothes for the fleet. Muller looked down at his own uniform. It was stiff with salt and diesel. He felt filthy. He felt primitive. The psychological impact of cleanliness is profound. A clean soldier feels human. A dirty soldier feels like an animal. The Americans understood this. They mechanized hygiene. They ensured that their men felt civilized, even while killing. Muller thought of the lice that infested the German trenches on the Eastern Front. He thought of the skin diseases that plagued his own crew. The German High Command called this hardening. They said it made the men tough. Muller now realized it just made them miserable. The American approach wasn't softness, it was efficiency. A clean soldier is a healthy soldier. A healthy soldier fights longer. The laundry ship was the ultimate expression of the American refusal to compromise their standard of living. They had taken the most mundane, domestic chore, doing the laundry, and turned it into a strategic asset. Muller looked at the steam rising from the presses. It looked like the breath of a dragon. A dragon that breathed cleanliness and order. And he knew his dirty, bearded, heroic crew didn't stand a chance against it. That night, Muller was placed in a cabin. Not a brig cell, but a guest cabin. He sat at a desk. There was a lamp. There was paper and a pen. He began to write a letter to his wife in Hamburg. He knew it would likely be censored, but he had to write it. His hand shook. "My dearest," he wrote. "I am alive. The war is over for me." He looked around the clean, bright room. "I have seen the enemy. And I have seen the future." He tried to describe what he had seen. The ice cream. The white bread. The garbage cans full of steak. "We were told they were weak," he wrote. "We were told they were a mongrel race, obsessed with money. But they have turned money into a weapon. We fought with spirit. They fight with things. And they have so many things." He thought about the propaganda posters in Berlin. Rad oder Ketten? Wheels or tracks? The slogans about sacrifice. They were lies. "We never had a chance," he wrote. "We were fighting an avalanche with a shovel." He realized that the bravery of his friends, the sacrifice of the U-boat crews, the millions dead, it was all for nothing. They were crushed not by superior strategy, but by superior logistics. They were beaten by a country that could put an ice cream machine on a warship and not even think it was strange. He put the pen down. He felt a profound exhaustion. The anger was gone. The hate was gone. There was only the cold, hard realization of the truth. Germany had fought a romantic war of heroes. America had fought an industrial war of managers. And the managers had won. The next morning, Muller stood on the deck of the USS Supply. He watched his U-boat, UE-1234, being towed behind. It looked small, dark, and pathetic against the massive gray flanks of the American fleet. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out his Iron Cross. It was the symbol of his bravery. The symbol of his service to the Reich. He looked at it. It felt heavy. It represented a world of blood and iron. A world of sacrifice and scarcity. He looked at the American sailors walking past him. They were eating donuts. They were laughing. They lived in a world of aluminum and plastic. A world of abundance. He realized that his Iron Cross belonged to a dead world. A world that had been obliterated by the sheer weight of American production. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the medal over the rail. It splashed into the Atlantic Ocean and vanished. Muller turned his back on the sea. He walked toward the galley. He wanted another coffee. He was a prisoner of war. But for the first time in years, he wasn't hungry. And in that full stomach lay the final defeat of the Third Reich. The ideology of the master race had surrendered to the ideology of the full fridge. The war was over. And the ice cream barge had won.